Right, so you've gathered all of your elements and now it's time to stitch everything together. Now, where you place everything is a kind of a matter of preference. Now, but it's largely dictated by the image that you've chosen. So for example, my title up here. Now, I couldn't have my title down below because it blocks the main focal point of the image. I'd have to either center it or keep it up top, nice where it is. So this also ties into what we were talking about in the previous lesson where it comes to choosing your image. Ideally, you would have an image with this kind of a blank or an empty spot that you can put all of your text. So these are the things that absolutely do need to be on your cover, right? You obviously need to have the name of your book and your name. Now, if you have a subtitle, you can stick that in there as well. There are optional things that you can also put on your cover that will help sell it and basically help just hook in the reader a little bit. So if you are a New York Times best-selling author, a million-selling author, a Nebula award-winning author, anything like this here, anything that shows that you are successful, then stick it on your book. Now, it does not have to be related to this series at all. If you have a previous series that sold 1 million books, you're still a million-selling author. Now, if you've won a sci-fi young author of the year for your very first book, then you put it on every single book from that point on. Now, you will see this as well on professionally published books. So this does not have to relate to this title. It just has to relate to you. Anything that shows, again, that you are a good read. Now, you can also have a small quote about your book. Now, if this is attributed to somebody known, then it's even better. Like if you get, for example, Stephen King or George R. R. Martin or something like this that has a quote for your book, then people will buy this just based on that. So again, if you have a quote and it's attributed, then stick it on. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody famous, or it doesn't necessarily have to be attributed at all. If you have your book out on your early reading list and somebody comes back with a really nice review and a really nice cover, like I don't know, this is the best series that I've ever read, then you can put that on your cover. It doesn't necessarily have to have a name behind it. Now, you can also have a small one-line pitch. Now, if you don't have a quote, you can just stick in a one-line pitch. Again, something that reinforces exactly what the book is about, or just kind of entices that little bit of curiosity here about it. Now, on the flip side, there are some things that should not be on your cover. You should not have anything like this, a novel or a novella or anything like this. This is obvious. By default, people expect that it's a novel. Now, if you're like, okay, but it's a novella and I don't want people to complain because it's short or whatever it is, normally this is reflected in the price, or just stick it in your description. It should not be on your cover. It does not belong on your cover. Now, you can have something like this, insert main character here, novel. Again, this shouldn't really be on your cover because most people won't know who this is. Now, this is mainly just for your fans, the people that actually, anybody that knows who this is going to know that it's a Murder Mike novel because ideally you've already told them through your mailing list. This isn't something that needs to be on the cover. Anything that describes what the cover is, like a horror thriller. If you have to write this, then you have failed in your cover design because this should immediately be obvious based on everything that you've set up over the previous lessons, from the font to the image to everything. You should not need to tell anybody what it is, what type of book it is. And lastly, if it's like book one of the blah, blah, blah trilogy or saga, again, this is not something that needs to be there. Now, for that, you might ask, but like, how will people know that this is book one of the Dreamwalker Sagemaster trilogy or whatever? Well, take a look at any professionally printed trilogy that you own and ask if you see it on the front cover. So now we come to weight. Now, unless your name is Stephen King and you're selling books solely based on your name, your book title is going to have the most weight. It's the most important thing on your cover. So there it is. Therefore, it should be the biggest thing on your cover. Now, ideally, it should be big enough to read when your book is a thumbnail. But again, that depends on the font that you use. Or if, for example, sometimes like here, we've added some texture or font because it brings out that something a little bit special. However, when it comes down to a thumbnail, it gets less and less readable. Now, again, if we had our title it all depends on positioning. If we have our title here or down here, it's a little bit more readable. Or if we don't have, for example, if we don't have the handprint, then it's a little bit better. But again, so all of it is, it's kind of like a balance with how you want your eventual thing to go, or what's most important to you. Now, you center your text always. And with rare exceptions, include enough margin around it so that it has some breathing room. Now, occasionally I have seen where you can have the text that is bigger than this. Hold on. I need to do the entire thing, sorry. Up. There we go. Now, I have seen titles like this. Now, you could do that if it's part of your style. Like, for example, I don't know if anybody remembers the Windows Phone OS that had this sort of behavior. It kind of can come across as quite stylish depending on what you're doing. But there needs to be absolutely zero confusion as to what the name of your book is. You need to be able to read this and know that it is The Cabin and not The Cabinine or something like this. So ideally what you'd have, you'd bring it down, give it enough space. And yet you do have to give it enough space. Now you can't, if you say, okay, I'm going to bring it as big as possible, like this here, like that, it just looks, it looks bad because it looks cramped. You know, you ideally need to just give it that little bit more. And in general, it's like the more you give it, the better it's going to look like. So again, don't bring it too tight. And in terms of space, ideally it's equal on all three sides, assuming your text isn't vertically centered in the middle. Now, for your author name, you may or may not be using the same font. You may or may not have a long name. So again, that will dictate where you put it. Now, whether your author name comes before your title, in the middle, down below, again, it's all preference. I personally like to put it around the title so that it's linked. But do keep in mind the invisible lines that we draw when it comes to aligning things. Like so here, for example, on this N, we have an invisible line that now runs the length of the book. So I'm just going to turn on the guides here for a minute. So if I move my text over like this, again, if it's not completely centered on this invisible line, you're going to immediately notice it. Now, you might not understand why it is. You might be saying, okay, but I'm centering on this C, or I'm aligning it to the C. But again, the C, because it's curved, it's less important than this straight line going down the right hand side. Now, my name is kind of long enough that I could actually probably get away with actually making it the exact size of this title. It's all, again, that's all preference, but just keep that in mind that there is lines drawn that you might not realize it, but you will definitely realize that if it's not right. There's always one down the center and generally one down the sides, and that all depends on what the most important part of your image and where that is placed. Now, if you're aligning your name with the title, keep in mind the margin between them. So here we have a nice little space between the and cabin. All right, we want to keep that space between the cabin and your name, because if it's a little bit off, what am I doing? If it's a little bit off, then you're going to notice it. It doesn't really look quite right. So you either kind of need to separate your name completely, like down here, for example, or just respect that distance. In terms of font size, you can take a leaf out of the Web Design Handbook and use the Golden Ratio Calculator. Yep, let me just know what it is. The Golden Ratio Calculator is something that I use every time I'm designing a website. What it is you select your font, so say Arial, wherever it is here, Arial, or Arial Black. And we say, okay, our main font size is whatever. Now in my picture, it's 400, but obviously I'm not going to put 400 because it won't be readable. So we divide by 10, we put 40. And then our cover is 1600, but again, we divide by 10. And it gives you a golden ratio. And these are all the different font sizes, where, for example, this is my base font 30, but I can go down to 31, 22, 14, 9 and stuff. That means that your different fonts will visually balance in relation to your title. So this is kind of important. Like, just you can't wing it, I guess. I suppose it all depends on basically the size of your name or the other just different text and stuff that you have in the thing. But if you want to kind of keep it visually balanced, then use something like the golden ratio. Now, any quotes or bylines should be on the top or the bottom. So here we have a nice big quote tag. Let me just remove all this. We have a nice quote. Now it should be on the bottom, and ideally it'll be in a different font, and this helps keep it mentally separate from the rest of your cover. But it also helps associate it with it having been awarded to your book rather than it being an integral part of the design. So if, for example, we have the New York Times bestseller, again, this is an award. It's something that you've received. So having it separate from the title means that it reinforces that behavior. And it also stops it distracting too much from the main design, which is pretty important, because you want somebody saying, okay, you obviously don't want somebody thinking that the name of your title is New York Times bestselling author. Now keep each piece of text on its own layer. This will let you move it around as you want. Okay, so that you can find the best place for it. If it's not in its own layer, then you won't be able to do this, and it's kind of awkward. Don't be afraid to look at other covers to figure out what they do. Like this is either on books that you own or on cover websites. For example, one of the very first tutorials that we were doing, or that we looked at, the videos that we looked at, was we had a lot of pre-made cover sites. You know, there's like one of them had 17,000 covers. So that's 17,000 examples that you can look at to get the best layout. Now, there is no one golden layout, all right? Each book is separate. The only thing that I would say is that if you're making a trilogy of books, that your title and the positioning of your elements is similar across all books. Because if you have, say, for example, a cabin up here, and down below is the cabin 2, and it's here, and the third one is 3, like it's just not going to look great when they're all side by side. And you kind of want, when it comes to trilogies, you need to reinforce that linkage between each book of the series. And that generally means keeping your text and keeping your images, keeping those common elements running right through the entire series.